All right, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at how we experience mental effort and load when we learn.
Yeah. And this is especially interesting when we think about all the different languages that people use all around the world to learn.
Right, right. Like, are there fundamental differences? Do people who speak, Mandarin experience effort differently than, say, people who are learning in English?
That's a really interesting question. And the research that we're going to be diving into today actually tackles that head on.
Cool, cool. So what is it we're looking at today?
So the main source for today's deep dive is an open access article. It was published in the Educational Psychology Review on January 10th, 2025.
Okay.
And the title is a bit of a mouthful, but it's Developing the Mental Effort and Load Translingual Scale, LL10TS, as a Foundation for Translingual Research in Self-Regulated Learning.
Okay. So MELA-TS. Got it.
Yeah, MELO-TS.
LTS.
That's their new scale that they developed.
Okay, okay. And so why should our listeners care about this?
Well, this research is really important for anyone who wants to understand how we learn and how we can learn more effectively,
Right.
because it looks at how much mental energy we invest in learning and how challenging learning feels to us.
Right, right. I mean, we've all had those moments where we're really struggling with a new concept, right? And so is this research kind of getting at like why that is?
It is getting at why that is and how we can maybe improve those situations.
Cool.
And it also considers, how those experiences might be different depending on the languages we speak and the cultures we come from.
Got it. So this is really relevant for anyone who's, interested in just learning more effectively and understanding how their own brain works. But it also has implications for, the research itself, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Because research on learning comes from all over the world,
Mm.
often in different languages.
Right.
And if we can't accurately compare those findings across languages, then our understanding of learning could be incomplete.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So the researchers who conducted this study, they really wanted to create a tool that could be used to reliably measure mental effort and load in a way that's sensitive to those cultural and linguistic differences.
Right, so that regardless of where the research is coming from or what language it's conducted in, we can have a more standardized way of measuring these concepts, right?
That's exactly right. So that we're all speaking the same language, so to speak, when we're talking about mental effort and load.
I like that. Okay, so what were some of the core challenges that they addressed in this study?
Well, one of the biggest challenges they highlighted is what they call a monolingual bias in educational research.
Okay, what is monolingual bias?
What they mean by that is that a lot of research in education is conducted in just one language, usually the researcher's native language.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense, right? You're going to be most fluent and comfortable in your own language.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some advantages to that. It can allow for more nuanced data coding, and it makes it easier to develop tasks and materials that are really specific to that language.
Right, right. But I guess the downside is that you might be missing out on how other people experience the same concepts.
Exactly. So the problem is that this monolingual approach can overlook the fact that learners come from all sorts of different linguistic backgrounds.
Right. So we could be missing out on valuable insights from people who learn differently or who experience effort and load differently because of their language.
Exactly.
Okay. So how does this practically impact how we interpret research?
Well, for example, imagine you're looking at two studies on how students learn math, one done in English and one done in Japanese.
Okay.
If those studies use different ways of measuring or even conceptualizing mental effort, it becomes really hard to compare their findings.
Right, because even if they're both using the same label, mental effort, they might be tapping into slightly different aspects of the experience.
Ex-
Kind of like, comparing apples and oranges, even though they're both fruit.
That's a great analogy. And this problem becomes even more pronounced when researchers try to combine the findings of multiple studies in something called a meta-analysis.
Right, because if the underlying measures aren't truly equivalent across languages, then the conclusions of that meta-analysis might be misleading.
Exactly.
Okay, and how does this monolingual bias specifically impact the study of cognitive demand?
Well, in the field of self-regulated learning, SRL for instance, researchers are really interested in how learners manage their own cognitive resources.
Right, so how they set goals, plan their learning, monitor their progress.
Exactly. And to study this, researchers often draw on insights from different languages and cultures, to get a broader perspective.
Right, because effective learning strategies might vary across different contexts.
Absolutely. But if the way we measure or even understand cognitive demand is skewed by a particular language or culture, then it becomes much harder to draw meaningful conclusions from these cross-cultural comparisons.
So we could end up with a very limited view of how self-regulated learning works based on just one dominant linguistic perspective.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so that's the problem of monolingual bias. What about the challenges of translation itself?
Right, so even when researchers recognize this issue and want to study cognitive demand across languages, they run into another hurdle,
Which
the
is,
challenge of translating the concept of cognitive demand itself.
okay. Yeah, I can see how that would be tricky. Like, how do you make sure the meaning is truly equivalent when you're switching between languages?
Right. The article points out that there are two common approaches to translation in research:
Yeah.
literal translation and cultural adaptation.
Okay, so literal translation would be like just swapping out the words for their direct equivalents in the new language.
Exactly. Word for word translation.
Okay. And cultural adaptation is more about trying to capture the spirit of the concept rather than the exact wording.
Right. It's more about finding a way to express the same idea in a way that makes sense in the new culture.
Okay, I see. So each approach has its pros and cons.
Exactly. With literal translation, the risk is that you might end up with a translation that's technically correct, but doesn't really capture the subtle nuances of the original meaning.
Right, because words can have different connotations or associations in different languages.
Precisely. So you could end up with a translation that's grammatically sound, but just doesn't feel quite right or doesn't convey the intended meaning.
Okay. And what about the drawbacks of cultural adaptation?
Well, with cultural adaptation, the main challenge is ensuring that the adapted version is actually measuring the same underlying construct as the original version.
Right, because if you're changing the questions or the wording too much, you could end up measuring something entirely different.
Exactly. So you might have a questionnaire that's culturally relevant, but not actually comparable to the original version, which defeats the purpose of doing cross-cultural research.
I see. So it's a real balancing act, trying to find that sweet spot between linguistic accuracy and cultural sensitivity.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes the MEL-TS research so interesting. They took a very deliberate approach to translation, involving bilingual individuals in every step of the process to make sure they were capturing both the linguistic and the cultural nuances of the concepts.
Okay, fascinating. Now, you mentioned earlier that there are two different theoretical frameworks for thinking about cognitive demand: cognitive load theory, CLT, and self-regulated learning, SRL. Can you walk us through how those two differ?
Certainly. So CLT, or cognitive load theory, is a really influential framework in educational psychology. It's primarily focused on how we can manage the demands on our working memory during learning.
Okay, yeah, like how much information we can hold in our minds at once.
Exactly. And CLT proposes that there are three types of cognitive load: intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load.
Okay, can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. So intrinsic load refers to the inherent complexity of the information itself.
Okay, so like learning calculus is going to have a higher intrinsic load than learning basic addition.
Precisely. Extraneous load, on the other hand, is the load that's imposed by the way the information is presented.
Okay, so a poorly designed textbook could increase extraneous load.
Exactly. And finally, germane load refers to the cognitive resources that we invest in actually making sense of the information, like building connections, elaborating, and so on.
Okay, so germane load is the effort we put into really understanding the material.
Precisely. And CLT research is often focused on how we can minimize extraneous load and maximize germane load to optimize learning.
Okay, so it's a very like design-oriented approach. You're trying to create learning environments that are efficient and don't overload the learner's working memory.
Exactly. And a lot of CLT research has been conducted in very structured learning environments where the teacher has a lot of control over what and how students learn.
Okay, so how does SRL, self-regulated learning, differ from that?
Well, SRL takes a broader perspective. It looks at how learners manage their own learning, even in less structured environments.
Okay, so SRL acknowledges that learners have a lot more agency and control over their own learning process.
Precisely. It emphasizes things like setting goals, planning your study time, choosing strategies, monitoring your progress, and adapting your approach as needed.
Right. So it's a much more holistic view of learning, recognizing that it's not just about passively absorbing information, but also about actively managing your own learning journey.
Exactly. And because of this emphasis on self-direction, the researchers argue that the traditional ways of measuring cognitive load in CLT might not be the best fit for SRL research.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that. Why not?
Well, for example, in CLT, extraneous load often focuses on things like the format of the learning materials or how distractions are minimized.
Right.
But in SRL, the learner often has much more control over their learning environment.
Okay, yeah. So extraneous load might not be as much of a concern if you can choose to study in a quiet place or design your own learning materials.
Exactly. So while the concepts of intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load are still relevant in SRL, they might not capture the full complexity of cognitive demand in these more self-directed learning contexts.
Okay. So, what do the researchers propose as an alternative way of thinking about cognitive demand in SRL?
They suggest focusing on the distinction between mental load and mental effort.
Okay. And can you remind us of the difference between those two?
Certainly. So mental load refers to the overall cognitive demand that you experience during learning. It's often described as a feeling of mental strain or being overwhelmed.
Okay. So, it's like the weight of all the cognitive processing you're doing.
Exactly. And it can come from various sources like the complexity of the material, distractions in the environment, or even your own anxieties about learning.
Right. It's that overall feeling of being mentally taxed, regardless of what's causing it.
Precisely. Mental effort, on the other hand, is the cognitive energy that you actively choose to invest in learning.
Okay. So, it's more about that conscious decision to engage and exert mental effort.
Exactly. And the researchers argue that this distinction is particularly relevant for SRL because self-regulated learners are constantly making choices about how they allocate their cognitive resources.
Right. They're deciding what to study, how to study it, and how much effort to put in.
Precisely. So understanding how learners experience and regulate their mental effort becomes crucial for understanding how they learn effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. And they also mentioned some specific factors that can influence mental load in SRL that aren't always captured in traditional CLT measures, right?
Yes, they highlight three key factors: metacognition, duration of learning, and worry cognitions.
Okay, let's unpack those. What do they mean by metacognition?
Metacognition basically means thinking about your own thinking.
Okay,
It's that ability to monitor your own understanding, assess your progress, and adjust your strategies as needed.
right. So it's like having an inner dialogue about your own learning process.
Exactly. And the researchers argue that metacognition itself imposes a cognitive load.
Okay, so the very act of thinking about how you're learning takes up mental resources.
Precisely. And this is something that's not always accounted for in CLT research, which often focuses on more structured learning environments where the learner doesn't have to make as many decisions about their own learning process.
Right. Because in those environments, the teacher is often guiding the metacognitive aspects, like setting goals and choosing strategies.
Exactly. But in SRL, the learner is responsible for all of that, which adds to their mental load.
Okay. And what about the duration of learning? How does that affect mental load?
Well, this one's pretty intuitive. The longer you engage in a mentally demanding task, the more mental load you're likely to experience.
Right. It's like mental fatigue.
Exactly. And this is something that's also not always considered in CLT research, which often uses shorter tasks in controlled laboratory settings.
Okay. But in real world learning, people often have to study for much longer periods.
Precisely. And the researchers point out that this prolonged mental effort can have a significant impact on learning effectiveness.
Okay. And lastly, they mentioned worry cognitions. What are those and how do they contribute to mental load?
Worry cognitions refer to those anxious thoughts and feelings that we sometimes experience when we're learning.
Okay, yeah. Like feeling stressed about an upcoming test or doubting your ability to understand a concept.
Exactly. And research has shown that these negative thoughts can actually interfere with learning by taking up valuable cognitive resources.
Okay, so it's like your brain is trying to process the information and manage your anxiety at the same time, which can be overwhelming.
Precisely. And the researchers suggest that even small things like taking a break for physical activity can help to reduce these worry cognitions and free up mental resources for learning.
Okay, so it's important to be mindful of those emotional and cognitive factors that can contribute to mental load, especially in SRL.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about mental load in SRL. What about mental effort? How does that play out in this context?
Mental effort in SRL is really interesting because it's seen as both a challenge and a resource.
Okay.
How so? Well, on the one hand, mental effort can be demanding. It takes energy to actively engage with the material, to try to make sense of it, and to persist when things get tough.
Right.
But on the other hand, mental effort is also seen as a key driver of learning.
Okay. How so?
Well, research has shown that when we invest more mental effort, we tend to learn more deeply and retain information for longer periods.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, the more you wrestle with a concept, the better you understand it.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of desirable difficulties comes in.
Okay. What are desirable difficulties?
Desirable difficulties are those learning strategies that make the learning process feel more challenging in the moment, but actually lead to better long-term learning.
Okay. Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. So some classic examples of desirable difficulties include things like testing yourself, spacing out your study sessions, and interleaving different subjects or topics.
Okay. And the idea is that these strategies force you to engage more deeply and make more effort to retrieve the information, which strengthens the learning.
Exactly. And the researchers argue that mental effort is a crucial component of these desirable difficulty effects.
Okay. So by choosing to engage in these more effortful strategies, learners are actually promoting their own learning.
Precisely. And this is one of the reasons why the researchers believe that measuring mental effort is so important in SRL research. It gives us a window into how learners are regulating their own learning and choosing to engage with the material.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, even though they're highlighting these distinctions between CLT and SRL, the researchers also acknowledge that there's some overlap between the two, right?
Yes, absolutely. They point out that a valid measure of cognitive demand in SRL should still be able to detect those classic cognitive load effects that we see in CLT research.
Okay, so it's like a validation check. If their new MELA-TS scale can also capture those established CLT findings, it suggests that it's actually measuring something meaningful about cognitive demand.
Exactly. And they specifically cite previous research showing that intrinsic and extraneous load in CLT tend to be related to self-reported mental load, while germane load is more closely associated with self-reported mental effort.
Okay, so there's some convergence between those two frameworks, even though they have different emphases?
Precisely. And the researchers used this overlap to their advantage when they were designing their validation studies for the MELA-TS.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that. How did they use CLT to validate their new SRL scale?
Well, they designed their experiments so that they could manipulate those classic CLT load types: intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load.
Okay, and how did they do that?
So to manipulate intrinsic load, they varied the complexity of the tasks that participants had to complete.
Okay, so some tasks were inherently more difficult than others.
Exactly.
Mm.
And to manipulate extraneous load, they introduced distracting information into some of the tasks.
Okay, like irrelevant images or sounds that could divert attention.
Precisely. And finally, to manipulate germane load, they used motivational prompts and scenarios to encourage participants to invest more effort in some of the tasks.
Okay, so they were trying to create situations where participants would naturally feel more motivated to engage deeply with the material.
Exactly. And by doing this, they could see how the MELA-TS responded to these manipulations and whether it was sensitive to those same cognitive load effects that we see in CLT research.
Okay, so they were using CLT as a sort of benchmark to see if their new scale was on the right track.
Precisely.
Cool. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of this research is how they delve into the cultural and linguistic influences on how we experience and report mental effort and load.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how those factors come into play?
Absolutely. So this is where things get really interesting because it starts to bridge the gap between cognitive science and cultural psychology.
Okay.
The researchers point out that research in cognitive science has increasingly shown that the language we speak can actually shape how we think and perceive the world around us.
Okay, yeah, like the classic example of how some languages have specific words for colors that don't exist in other languages, and that can affect how people perceive those colors.
Exactly. And the researchers argue that similar principles apply to how we experience and report mental effort and load.
Okay. So our linguistic background can actually influence how we interpret and respond to those questions about how much effort we're putting in or how mentally demanding a task feels.
Precisely. And they highlight that most of the existing questionnaires and scales that we use to measure these constructs were originally developed in languages like Dutch, German, and English.
Okay. So there's a potential bias baked into those measures right from the start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And simply translating those measures directly into other languages might not capture the subtle nuances of how those concepts are understood in different cultures.
Right. Because even if the words themselves translate literally, the underlying cultural connotations and associations might be different.
Precisely. And they give a really interesting example from German. They point out that the way you say it was strenuous in German, which often relates to mental load, is slightly different from the way you say I made an effort, which relates to mental effort.
Okay. So even though both phrases could be used to describe a challenging learning experience, they carry slightly different meanings and emphasize different aspects of the experience.
Exactly. And not all languages have such clear-cut distinctions in their wording.
Right. So a direct translation might not capture those subtle differences in meaning, which could lead to inaccurate or misleading comparisons across cultures.
Precisely.
Okay. And what about the alternative approach of trying to create culturally adapted versions of the questions?
Right. So instead of directly translating the wording, researchers might try to come up with new questions that feel more culturally relevant.
Okay, yeah. Like instead of asking someone if they exerted a lot of effort, you might ask them if they put their heart and soul into it.
Exactly. And while this approach might make the questionnaire feel more natural and relatable to participants from that culture, it also introduces a new challenge.
Which is?
Ensuring that those culturally adapted questions are actually measuring the same underlying construct as the original questions.
Right. Because if you're changing the wording too much, you could end up measuring something different, even if it feels similar on the surface.
Exactly. So you might have a questionnaire that's very culturally sensitive, but not actually comparable to the original version, which makes it difficult to draw meaningful conclusions from cross-cultural comparisons.
Okay, I see. So it's a real dilemma. You want to be culturally sensitive, but you also want to make sure you're measuring the same thing across cultures.
Absolutely. And this is where the researchers' emphasis on a translingual approach becomes really important.
Okay, what do they mean by a translingual approach?
They mean that instead of simply translating or adapting existing measures, they want to develop a new scale that was grounded in a deep understanding of how these concepts are understood across different languages and cultures from the very beginning.
Okay, so they're trying to build a bridge between those different linguistic and cultural perspectives right from the start, rather than trying to retrofit existing measures.
Exactly.
And how did they go about doing that?
Well, they used a really interesting mixed methods approach.
Okay.
First, they conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with bilingual individuals who were fluent in English, Dutch, Spanish, German, Mandarin Chinese, and French.
Okay. So they were really trying to get a diverse range of perspectives on these concepts.
Precisely. And these interviews were designed to explore how participants understood and experienced mental effort and load in each of those languages.
Okay. So they were looking for commonalities and differences in how these concepts were expressed and experienced across those different linguistic and cultural contexts.
Exactly. And they also had participants translate and back-translate potential questionnaire items to make sure the meaning was preserved.
Okay, so they were really trying to ensure that the wording of the questions was both linguistically accurate and culturally sensitive.
Precisely. And then, based on those qualitative insights, they developed the initial version of the MLTS.
Okay, and then they tested it out in quantitative experiments, right?
Exactly. They conducted experiments in English, Mandarin Chinese, and German to see how the scale performed in those different linguistic settings.
Okay, cool. And what were they looking for in those experiments?
They were primarily interested in what's called construct validity, which basically means making sure that the scale actually measures what it's supposed to measure.
Okay, so it's like making sure that your ruler actually measures length and not weight.
Precisely. And construct validity has several different aspects. One is content validity, which means making sure that the scale covers all the relevant aspects of the concept you're trying to measure.
Okay, so in this case, it's about making sure that the MLTS captures the full range of experiences and nuances associated with mental effort and load.
Exactly. And they already addressed this to some extent through those initial qualitative interviews where they explored how people from different backgrounds understood these concepts.
Right, so they used those qualitative insights to inform the development of the scale itself.
Precisely. Another aspect of construct validity is criterion validity, which means checking whether the scale relates to other measures or predicts outcomes in the way you'd expect.
Okay, so it's about seeing if the scale's scores actually correspond to real-world behaviors or experiences.
Exactly. And in their experiments, they used those classic CLT manipulations to test criterion validity.
Okay. So they were looking to see if the Melatius was sensitive to those same cognitive load effects that we see in CLT research.
Precisely. And they also looked at convergent validity, which means checking whether the scale correlates with other measures that are supposed to be measuring similar things.
Okay. So it's like checking if your new thermometer gives you similar readings to an existing thermometer.
Exactly. And they compared the MEL-TS scores to scores on existing cognitive load questionnaires to see if there was a reasonable degree of overlap.
Okay. So they were looking for consistency between their new scale and established measures.
Precisely. And finally, they looked at incremental validity, which means checking whether the scale provides unique information beyond what you can already get from other measures.
Okay. So it's like asking, does this new scale tell us anything new that we didn't already know?
Exactly. And they compared the MEL-TS scores to participants' ratings of how difficult they found the tasks to see if the MEL-TS was capturing something unique about cognitive demand beyond just perceived difficulty.
Okay. So they wanted to make sure that their new scale wasn't just redundant with existing measures.
Precisely.
Okay, so that's a lot of different types of validity.
It is, but they're all important for ensuring that the scale is actually measuring what it's supposed to measure in a meaningful and reliable way.
Okay, so let's talk about what they actually found in their experiments. What were the key findings related to mental load?
Well, for mental load, the findings were pretty consistent across the three languages they tested: English, Mandarin Chinese, and German.
Oh, okay.
They found that increasing the complexity of the task led to significant increases in reported mental load.
Okay, so that supports the idea that intrinsic load, the inherent difficulty of the task, contributes to mental load.
Exactly. And they also found that adding distracting information to the tasks tended to increase mental load, although this effect was stronger in the English sample than in the German and Mandarin Chinese samples.
Okay, so there might be some cultural or linguistic differences in how susceptible people are to distractions.
That's one possible interpretation. And interestingly, they found that the motivational prompts didn't have a significant effect on overall mental load.
Okay, so even if you're feeling more motivated, the task might still feel just as mentally demanding.
That seems to be the case.
Okay, interesting. And what about the findings related to mental effort?
For mental effort, they found that increasing task complexity led to higher reported mental effort in English and Mandarin Chinese, but not in German.
Okay, so there might be some cross-cultural differences in how people respond to task complexity in terms of their effort investment.
Exactly. And they found that the distracting information didn't have a significant impact on mental effort in any of the languages.
Okay, so even if distractions increase your mental load, they might not necessarily make you feel like you're putting in more effort.
That's an interesting distinction. And they found that the motivational prompts only seemed to increase mental effort when the tasks were already quite complex.
Okay, so it seems like motivation might only really kick in and influence effort when we're faced with a significant challenge.
That's one possible interpretation.
Okay, and how did the MLTS perform in terms of those different types of validity we talked about earlier?
Well, overall, it showed the expected patterns of correlation with existing CLT measures.
Okay, so mental load on the MLTS tended to be correlated with intrinsic and extraneous load as measured by CLT scales, while mental effort on the MLTS was more closely related to germane load.
Exactly. So that provides some support for convergent validity.
Right. It suggests that the MLTS is tapping into similar constructs as those established CLT measures.
Precisely. And in terms of incremental validity, they found that the MEL-TS did provide unique information beyond just perceived difficulty.
Okay, so it wasn't just redundant with those existing measures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, the mental load scale was sensitive to those distracting details, even when participants didn't report the task as being significantly more difficult.
Okay, so that suggests that the mental load scale is capturing something about the mental clutter or interference that we experience, even if we don't consciously perceive the task as being harder.
Precisely. And the mental effort scale seemed to be better at capturing the influence of motivation compared to some existing measures of germane load.
Okay, that's interesting. So it seems like the MLTS is able to capture those more subtle nuances of cognitive demand that might not be fully captured by traditional CLT measures.
That seems to be the case.
Cool. Now, as with any research, there are always limitations. What were some of the limitations that the researchers themselves acknowledged?
Right. They mentioned a few key things. One was that their translation process, primarily started with English or German as the base language for the questionnaire items.
Okay.
And while they did have a rigorous process of translation and back translation, this could have still introduced some subtle biases depending on the starting language.
Right. Because even with careful translation, there's always a risk that some of the nuances of the original meaning might get lost in translation.
Exactly. And they also acknowledged that their study design didn't allow them to fully examine what's called factorial validity.
Okay, and what is factorial validity?
Factorial validity is basically about making sure that the scale is measuring the same underlying constructs in the same way across all the languages.
Okay, so it's like checking if the scale is working consistently across those different linguistic contexts.
Exactly. And they weren't able to fully test this because of the way their study was designed.
Okay. And what about that potential ceiling effect in the Mandarin Chinese mental effort scale that you mentioned earlier?
Right. So they noticed that in the Mandarin Chinese version of the mental effort scale, participants tended to report relatively high levels of effort, even in conditions where you might expect them to report lower effort.
Okay. And they attributed this to cultural factors, right?
Exactly. They suggested that in Chinese culture, there's a strong emphasis on effort and hard work. And this might have made participants reluctant to report low levels of effort, even if that was their genuine experience.
Okay, so it's like there's a cultural norm against admitting that you didn't put in a lot of effort, even if the task wasn't that demanding.
That's one possible interpretation.
Okay. And how did they suggest addressing this potential ceiling effect in future research?
They suggested a few things. One was to use more extreme wording in the questions, like asking about very little effort instead of just little effort.
Okay. So by making the response options more extreme, you might be able to capture a wider range of experiences.
Exactly. And they also suggested being more specific about mental effort to reduce any sense that reporting low effort might reflect poorly on the individual.
Okay. So it's about framing the questions in a way that makes it clear that it's okay to admit that you didn't have to exert a lot of mental effort if the task wasn't that demanding.
Precisely.
Okay. So despite those limitations, what are some of the practical takeaways for researchers who might want to use the MLTS in their own work?
Well, the researchers offer some really valuable recommendations. One is to use the MLTS in conjunction with an internal reference point.
Okay, and what does that mean?
It means having participants rate the cognitive demand of the task in relation to a neutral baseline task that they completed beforehand.
Okay, so instead of just asking, how much mental effort did you put in, you'd ask, how much mental effort did you put in compared to this other task?
Exactly. And this can help to make the ratings more reliable because it gives participants a point of comparison.
Right, it's like anchoring their judgments to a specific experience.
Precisely.